we live in a one-party state. It's controlled by the left, and they control every single lever of power. I'm not saying that the right controlled everything. I don't think it would be any better, but it would be worse and better in different ways. It would be a different sort of light dystopia, which is what I think we're living through right now. It's like the slow collapse of a once great nation. Hopefully we can turn it around. But they certainly control everything. They control Hollywood, you control banking, now they control all the founts of actual political power, obviously control tech. Like there's really nothing there that's not controlled by the left. And when you have that kind of power, as we saw sort of really at the height of COVID, censorship just de facto happens.
Mike Solana, welcome to the Future's Edge podcast. I am Bob Icino. Jim Iorio will be joining us. I've always wanted to do this without him because I really don't actually like him. But he's good at this shit. So, Mike, thanks for being here. I want to start right away, if we could, with telling people like who you are and what you do. I think I'm a Pirate Wires subscriber for quite a bit of time. So hopefully that's the focus.
Yes. So, I mean, I guess I probably am most well known at this point I work at Founders Fund, which is a venture capital firm in San Francisco. But over the last couple of years, I've been building this media company called Pirate Wires. And these days, I mean, that's where I do most of my work, most of my writing. Pirate Wires is a media company. We're focused on the intersection of technology, politics, and culture, sort of interested especially in the ways that changes in technology change the way that we do things politically.
I don't know that it's your latest. I don't think I got to your latest, but I was reading the one before that. And it's one of the reasons that I reached out to you because I live in Southwest Florida. You are not there right now, right?
No, I'm in San Francisco this week for work, but I live in Miami.
Okay, you live in Southwest Florida. So the Python thing, man, the Burmese Python. So you went in depth, and I watched your whole podcast too with River and Brandon. Your entire podcast, you had a section that I took out of there and I listened to very closely about this Burmese Python thing. So this is a little out of the realm of what we normally do. But talk about that a little bit because it's not only, I mean, there's several invasive species down here. We deal with, where I'm at, I'm on the Gulf side. We deal with cane toads, which are invasive and they're poisonous to dogs. And they kill dogs. Like it's the number one killer of dogs on this side of the state of Florida. So talk about Florida, the python, what you guys were.
I mean, the python is the problem that I was focusing on just because it's the one that kind of first captured my imagination. But as you mentioned, Florida is in particular a state known for invasive species. Just this morning, I read about a new invasive species in Florida. It was I think it's like the giant African slug or something. It's a slug the size of your fist, and I'm pretty sure it's poisonous and carries meningitis, I believe. And they were freaking out. They just quarantined a city. It's crazy. But the three that I tend to focus on, the three that I focus in the piece that you're talking about over at Pirate Wires were the iguanas, the lionfish, two forms. So like iguanas less damaging or less dangerous, but damaging. The lionfish far more damaging and far more dangerous and kind of wreaking havoc in our ecosystem. But then also finally the Burmese python, and they exist in the Everglades. And what's interesting about them to me is like, unlike the lionfish, which is super uncontained, they're in the ocean, they could, get all over the place. They're sort of stuck. The Burmese python, the problem with the Burmese python exists basically just in the Everglades in Florida. And so if you have a self-contained problem like that, another story in synthetic biology that I've been watching for a while is the story of using CRISPR to create something called a gene drive in mosquitoes to genetically modify the mosquitoes in such a way as they go extinct. The idea behind that is you modify the mosquito to only produce males. You breed a bunch of them in captivity, you release them into the wild, and that species, there are a million different like sort of subspecies of mosquito. So like that one subspecies of mosquito in that region the population will crash to basically nothing. This was thought of as a way to destroy malaria because the malaria parasite only exists really in these like couple of mosquitoes, I believe is the kind of idea behind it. And it's easier to target the mosquitoes than it is to target malaria. But the idea is like you could potentially eradicate malaria. I got to thinking I was on a riverboat or speedboat in the Everglades, kind of hearing about the problem of the python. I'm like, we could just get rid of them. And they are a huge problem. I mean, they've destroyed at this point. I mean, Everglades are huge. I think people who are not from Florida don't realize this, but it's like twice the size of New Jersey is the Everglades.
Yeah,
It's an enormous
yeah,
piece of land, and
it's
within
massive.
that park, not over 95 to 99% of all mammalian species have been eradicated. All that's really left at this point, birds, like everything is gone. What you have alligators, and you've got these giant killer snakes. The snake population grows every year. It gets further and further north, and something has to be done. And so this is a way to do it: is to breed them in captivity, to breed the genetically modified snakes in captivity, release them into the wild, and gene drive them out of existence.
Just out of curiosity, do you know if the Burmese python are they strictly water based, or is that where they thrive the most? Because I back up to a nature preserve. It's called well, I don't want to say what it's called, but it's massive. It's 800-900 acres, and back there, according to the turkey hunters, I see wild turkeys in my yard all the time. By the way, city of Chicago guy most of my life, like the city. The last place I lived was Pilsen, where the most dangerous thing was the gunshots that I would hear once a week. Now the most dangerous thing is pumas, black bears.
Yeah.
I go into my backyard and I see these wild turkeys that are up to my chest. So I'm curious, and there's pumas, there's panthers rather, Florida panthers back there. So I'm wondering, is this just going to end up being a battle between the alligators and the pythons, and to see who can reproduce and eat each other? Because you mentioned in your
Yeah, they
prior
already
species.
are eating each other. And I think it is to a certain extent.
In other
I
words,
don't
is
know.
one going to extinct the other before you can get your gene splicing done?
No, because they, first of all, I'm not sure they're only primarily water based, because they've spotted, I think they like it. Obviously, they're in Everglades are very swampy, and that's clearly they're thriving there. But they've seen
Yeah.
them, they've identified them as like very far north. Like there have been unique cases of these things getting like really way far out there. They will eat each other, but it's difficult, and it's not, they're not going to extinct each other. They're just
Mhm.
going to the gators have all sorts of things they can eat in the water. The pythons are just going to spread out.
Come to the right podcast here. Are we talking about Florida swamps and gators and pythons? Is that correct? I might.
Yes.
Hey, if you don't know now, you know, Jimmy.
Now you know. How are you, Mike? Nice to meet you.
Good. Nice to meet you as well.
Yeah, so we were going over, again, one of the reasons that I reached out to Mike was this Burmese python story, because I just thought it was interesting as hell. And something that struck me that you said in that, and I'm going somewhere with this. First of all, I wonder if the idea, because it wasn't your idea, it was something you researched, right? The gene splicing.
The gene drive is something that I'd
Mosquito.
read about. In the
Okay.
mosquito.
So first of all, I wonder if that was somewhat clicked in this person's mind based on China's one baby policy and how they were all having men because they wanted boys in the family. And then they had to go to Korea to find wives for these boys as they grew up. But number two, you said that mosquitoes could go away and it wouldn't affect anything. So what struck me as super interesting when you and River and Brandon were talking about it was that you said that people think that every species has to be here and they don't. I've kind of always thought that, because like a lot of things have gone extinct and we're fine. And you actually said those words. So where does that come from? Like, where did you get the background on that?
On which part? The fact
Well,
that
every creature doesn't have to make it.
well, first of all, it's just like, it's kind of just obviously true, because species go extinct every year, tons of them, and have forever. And in fact, like, we have records of species going extinct, and like, here we are. I mean, life has been around for a long time, and the entire record of life is a record of species vanishing and new species emerging. But also, just, I guess, over the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, kind of just being curious about this stuff and researching, is you learn about like the keystone species. So there are some species that really matter. The honeybee is a good example, where a lot of things rely, specifically a lot of humans rely on that. And if it were to go extinct, probably a lot of people would starve to death because of it. That's very interesting and unique in the world of biology. There are lots of species that affect other species, but very rarely there are many different keystone species. There's a form of, I think, plankton or something, where like that feeds a certain kind of fish that feeds like most of the ocean. Like, there are these keystone species, but they are rare. And for the most part, like something like a mosquito or whatever goes extinct, and no one's going to care. No one's going to know.
Correct me if I'm wrong, because the mosquitoes killed more people on this planet than any other species, probably than most combined, right? So if the things that eat them, so how do we hasten this process? I want the mosquito gone.
Yeah, so in terms of the mosquito, that's the one that people actually, that's the gene drive experiment that people actually are aware of. It made a huge splash. I think it was like maybe 5 years ago now is when people first started talking about this. The news kind of broke for the first time of, that this was even possible. And from there, it got kicked to experiments, basically, like the governments of basically Africa, where most of the malaria damage is being done, were reluctant to just embrace this sort of unproven new technology. Surprise. So there have been a series of experiments in labs that have been conducted, and hopefully people, will be persuaded by them. The problem is, like, you have this serious anti-GMO sentiment that is shaping a lot of the discourse on this stuff. So anti-genetically modified organisms. And that starts with your food. People don't want to eat GMO bananas or something, and they want to know like exactly what happened to their food. But it extends in sort of almost every direction in this weird way where you were asking, about the idea that every single species is important. And I believe that, the average person does seem to have this sense. I certainly used to when I was a kid. And I think that just comes from culture. It's like Pocahontas. I think that was like the message of Pocahontas as the cartoon. It's like, everything is connected. It's the circle of life. One thing goes down and everything. The Lion King was the circle of life, right? That was the one where it was like, if you get rid of this one species, everything else is out of whack and all this kind of stuff. And that is maybe like rooted in this broader idea or this bigger idea, which is that nature is perfect. And it's almost a sort of religious idea that leads to things like also being anti-GMO. Like, not only is every creature have a place, but to change nature is seen as in some way insidious. It's a sin. And I think that's what you're dealing with. I think you're dealing with people who, they saw Ferngully or Pocahontas and they were like, that's my religion now.
Cool. So the GMO thing, which always irritates the crap out of me, because every food we eat is GMO, right? Hasn't it been going on for literally thousands of years that we genetically modify shit? So I mean, it just blows me away when people start to really rail against that. But about the meat, the genetically modified meat, particularly the lab grown chicken. If you guys, I mean, you saw this was a headline of the last couple of days. Are we right to have a reluctance to eat that crap? Things could go wrong, right?
Yeah, I think they could. I mean, things go wrong all the time. And I think to a certain extent, I used to be a lot more reckless on this kind of stuff when maybe around 5 years ago.
Wonder what that correlates to.
I mean, things like, I think about COVID and the lab leak and stuff like that. I used to consider aversion to things like gain of function research as highly like Luddite, ignorant sort of thinking. And I am embarrassed to say that it took a pandemic for me to reassess my opinion on that. And I reassessed it pretty quick, and then it was just sort of obvious. It was always right in my face. That, and also there's a book, I think Nassim Taleb did some damage to me, where he really got me thinking about Lindy, the concept of Lindy things and things that endure over time as being perhaps robust in some way or important in some way that we take for granted. And that goes from everything from like a chair to religion. And so there is something to that, I think. But at the same time, satellites are not Lindy, and all sorts of medicine are not Lindy. We like societies that are obsessed with Lindy things don't build rocket ships and go to the moon. And so or build skyscrapers for that matter. So it's like, if you want to progress as a people, or power plants, nuclear power plants, certainly not. If you want to progress as a people, you have to take some amount of risk, and there are going to be consequences to that thing for sure. But the reward is presumably worth it. And when you're dealing with things like food, for example, we can't feed the population without genetically modified food at this point. So it's not really much of a question.
So based on that, Mike, first of all, I think Nassim Taleb would be very happy to hear that he did some damage to you with that book. I think that's his target, and I love the guy. Back to this genetically modified chicken story. Just a little background for people that are watching, because again, this is not normally what we do from a perspective of this podcast, but I do want to take it sort of a little bit toward equities on this, because it's a big deal to know that Upside Foods and Good Meat just got an approval to actually sell lab grown meat, which will still take, I don't know, what do you guys think? Probably 7 to 10 years maybe before it actually makes it to like a grocery store shelf. But do you have a theory as to how you can get an institution like the FDA to matter I mean, if the FDA approved cell cultivated or cultured meat grown in basically a tank in the shapes of the food they're supposed to be at the grocery store, at least that's what I'm reading. They do it in like a drumstick and they put it in a container and they send it to the store. They do it in the shape of a sausage or shape of chicken nuggets and they just send it to the store like that. You have any theories as to how you fix that kind of a thing?
Well, I
Because
don't
to
know
me, it's
I'm not familiar with the story. So what's the problem?
so essentially, I don't know that there's a problem, but a California firm, Upside Foods, one of them, Good Meats another, just got FDA approval basically to sell chicken made from animal cells.
Do they
So
have
they
to
basically
disclose it though?
I don't know. I mean, again, the FDA and the
Well, that
FDA
sounds
is
great.
emergency.
It sounds great.
It
If you could
sounds
grow
great,
meat,
right?
if you could grow meat, not only is it a more humane way, but in a less energy intensive way, you're not feeding things, there are no emissions, there's less farmland, you can use the land for other things or nothing, let it go back to nature, have parks. That sounds great. But it's the question, I guess, is like, does it work? Um, so, I mean, presumably it's being, I don't know, I'm not following the story, but I mean, hopefully it's being studied closely and
Well, I guess that's what I'm asking you. I mean, if the FDA approved it, because that's what a lot of people are worried about now, right? I mean, you mentioned 5 years ago, and it's obvious we're talking about similar things when we talk about concerns with a regulatory body like the FDA. Is obviously let's take the good side of that. Okay, the FDA did an emergency use in the case of a worldwide pandemic, and now at least on the surface, it's turning out to be maybe that was a reckless decision. Trying not to use the wrong wording here. And I don't mean the wrong wording for cancellation. I don't give a shit about that. But I'm saying it, at the very best, it was a reckless decision to approve that based off of maybe bad testing, maybe incomplete testing. And you get a story like this where lab grown meat, which will turn a lot of people off right off the bat. And by the way, in that story, and I'll send it to you if you want, they're saying it might actually consume more energy because of the way
right
that
now
it's.
it does. I'm almost certain it does. Yeah, they're just beginning. It's super. I mean, the last that we looked at a whole bunch of lab grown meat companies years ago, and that energy consumption was always the problem. It took a lot to create it. On the vaccine, though, like I'm actually not sure that I don't think I agree with you at all. I don't think that it was the wrong decision to get the vaccines out very quickly. I think the wrong decision was forcing people to take it
Okay.
and or coercing people to take it. And it's especially shouldn't have been recommended to healthy, young, fit people. I think that was the problem. Having it available very fast for people who were at a really high risk. I mean, the risk of taking the vaccine is nothing compared to the risk of being obese and getting COVID, early days of COVID, when it
Right.
was still like a super virulent disease before the new strains came out. And it's like, it does seem to just be much weaker now. And so at that point, I mean, that was great. That was really, it was really great that it stepped aside. And then it's like, I mean, it's a horrible choice that you have to make. Do you take the risk of the virus or take the risk of the vaccine? No one wants to take a risk at all. It would be much better if we didn't have to take the risk.
Mhm.
But in that moment, we did. The math is obvious. If you are at risk, you definitely take the vaccine. And then the rest of us who are healthy, I mean, it sounds kind of grim, but we get to benefit from learning from the risks that you all just took. At this point, a lot of people have gotten this vaccine, right? So we have a lot of information on it. And despite, I think, what the sort of RFKs of the world would have you believe, there are absolutely risks, and there have absolutely been horrible things that have come of the vaccine. I think that's beyond dispute, but the number is very, very, very small. There's a long-term risk that we don't know about yet, and that could change everything. And I do worry about this. Who knows what it does? I don't know this stuff well enough. Like, I mean, and I was way too trusting, I guess, of the people who were telling me about it in the early days. So, I mean, yeah, I guess it is certainly conceivable that like there could be some insane health complication that comes from taking an mRNA shot, like, years down the line, 10 years, 20 years, or to our kids. But also, I mean, that same thing can be true of COVID. That's just the nature of new things. And COVID did a lot of damage to people who got it and got it bad. So who knows? I mean, I think who knows?
My question, I think what I'm teasing out of this, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that you are relatively confident that the FDA could look at this, lab grown meat, study, because we're obviously not going to break it down and put it under a microscope, but just study the molecular makeup of it and say this is just like regular meat. It is safe. And then you see, these guys, they told me not to eat eggs in 1977 because they would spike my cholesterol and I'd die of heart disease. So I have a lot of mistrust of them. But do you think my mistrust is misguided, is what I'm saying?
It's a safe bet. The skeptical person is maybe somewhat at an advantage in the world in general.
Well, thank you.
But what I'm trying to balance here is we all take some amount of risk in the world. And as a people, there is no progress without risk. So you have to decide what kind of world you want to live in. And it's like, if you want to live in some kind of technologically progressive world of abundant energy and food, and plenty more abundant resources and things like that requires technological innovation, which requires an assumption of risk. We already are taking tremendous amount of risk in society based on various technologies. New technologies pose not more risk, but new risk. So you're sort of letting go of certain risks and you're assuming new risks. There's a risk that your meat is tainted because of factory farming, which we have to do right now to feed the world. There's no way around it. So like we're already taking risks. It's like, what risks do you trade for what other risks? I think there's certainly risk. I'm not aware of what they are. And do I trust the FDA? My impulse with the FDA, especially on I don't know. This is, by the way, I don't know one goddamn thing about this story. It's just what you're telling me. And so you could be making it up right now and I have no idea, but based on the facts that you're presenting to me, it's like, if the Biden FDA has approved something in the space of technology, then my assumption is like, that's pretty good. It's a super, there's a massive anti-technology impulse there, a massive anti-tech bias. And especially when it comes to health, like people are highly suspicious. And the problem with the FDA historically has not been like, wow, they keep letting things go. It's been, they stand in the way of progress at every turn. So like based on priors, it's like all I have to go on not knowing anything about the story is like who is allowing it to happen. It's like based on that, it sounds like it's probably, I wouldn't say I would trust my life in the hands of it. I would want to look into it more, but I don't know. It doesn't sound terrible to me. And lab grown meat in general is something that I think is really interesting and it doesn't scare me. And most of this stuff doesn't scare me. I think I've like under COVID specific, it's like having something forced on you that is new and essentially experimental is evil. And my reaction to that was to step back away from all of this stuff for a minute and to be like, no, back to the basics. And like, I never said this, never wrote this, but like, I think that's probably where a lot of my stuff was coming from, was just like an instinctive step away from the people who were just trying to coerce me into getting something that ultimately I got the vaccine, but I never got the boosters. And
Same.
that doesn't mean that the technology itself can't be trusted. It just means that our government can't be trusted.
Yeah, and I think I want to jump back to what I was trying to say there was that safe and effective was presumptuous. Not necessarily that getting the emergency use vaccine out, that is what I said, but that's not. I had 2 shots as well. And then I just didn't get the booster after that. And it's interesting because in the same house, my wife did not, right? Because I have a pre-existing condition, very mild, no big deal, but I thought, this is worth it for me. Like you said, do the math in your own head and figure it out.
Being a stubborn dumbass is not a pre-existing condition.
No, right? Listen, no. It's funny. I had a brain tumor and everybody's like, how's your ass feel after surgery? I literally get that every single time.
And you will continue.
Right. Dumbest fucking joke. But so I want to clarify that because I wasn't necessarily saying that. And what I was trying to ask was, and maybe I sprung the meat thing on you, but the FDA itself, like you just mentioned, the Biden administration FDA. I'm not sure there's going to be trust in any institution for any of these things. And I also think it kind of sparked fears in people that can be unreasonable because the math just isn't necessarily presented to people. And even if there isn't math yet, because there's not enough data, you could say, look, 350 people a year die getting out of bed. Every single morning you get up to take a piss, you're taking a risk of dying, and you just do a quick risk reward calculation in your head saying it's probably not going to happen. So this is kind of my thought process on that. It brings me to climate and energy. I know I've read things on your stance on nuclear energy before in Pirate Wires. And so can you kind of go over that as to where you stand on sort of the energy and the climate situation in general?
I don't know what I think about it, to be honest. I think that's
a fair answer. We don't get that a lot.
Seems pretty clear that the planet is warming. And then from there, I think it's not necessarily, I think there's a pretty good evidence that we've contributed to that. At that point, there's a question of like what it means when the planet warms. And there is a case that actually it's better. like within a certain slight band, it could improve things. Robert Zubrin writes a lot about this. He wrote a lot of books. He wrote The Case for Mars, which is how I found him. He wrote a book called The Merchants of Despair, which touches on this stuff specifically. He believes that a lot of this is rooted, the sort of the environmentalism stuff, the concerns there are, it's rooted in something called anti-humanism. The idea is not to, to produce less to stop hurting the environment. Like, they just want there to be less people, and they believe that like people are the problem. I find it sort of, that's compelling to me. I think the thing is like, let's say that the global warming is caused by us. That's also sort of exciting because it means that we have an impact on the environment. And if you can make it warmer, you can make it cooler. And if you can take control, then you can terraform the earth. And so there are all sorts of things you can do to get to sort of like your ideal temperature. You can start talking about things like entering iron filings into the ocean to spike phytoplankton growth, spike the population of salmon so you get more food, and you're drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. For example, you can be digging out massive man-made lakes in the middle of the Sahara Desert, for example, and channeling ocean water into it, create sort of, once again, Lake Megachad, create a hydrologic cycle or a hydraulic cycle. Is it hydrologic or hydraulic? It's one of those two. When you're basically creating weather in the region, that water evaporating creates weather, creates rain, and you have now arable land in the middle of Africa. Again, you have a breadbasket. You can do that all over the world. That lowers the sea level and improves the area. Like, I'm not afraid, I guess, of the fact that we changed the planet. It doesn't scare me in the way that it seems to scare a lot of other people. And I think a lot of the predictions are pretty obviously crazy. Like Greta Thunberg just kind of famously got in trouble yesterday. Today's the 22nd. So yesterday was the 21st. Yeah. It was the 21st was exactly 5 years from a quote of hers in which there was an apocalyptic 5-year prediction. It's like, people have been making these crazy predictions since my dad was a kid. Like, there have always been some crazy environmental predictions. I think there's more to the global warming thing generally, but the bigger thing here to keep in mind is just that we are responsible for our world, human beings, and it should be hospitable to us. And what is the best for us people, the most piece of people, to keep them healthy and happy and thriving on this planet, we should just do that to the planet. And that could be a whole bunch of things, but chief among them is change.
I'm going to. I've never defended Greta Thunberg before, too, but I thought she was unfairly vilified yesterday because she didn't say that exactly. She said, if we don't end fossil fuels in the next 5 years, we're completely doomed. She didn't say we'd be doomed that day. It sounded to me like she was saying the die has been cast and now it's irreversible. In which case, then,
if she was right on that, then we might as well
just live it up, party up,
light it up now. If we're doomed anyway, the 5 years is expired.
So you said something, Mike, that I think is interesting, that some of the climate crazies, they just don't want as many people on the planet. We had Doomberg, he's an energy analyst. I don't know if you follow him at all, but he's fabulous.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, his point was, great, you first. It just is so simple and is so perfect because it's such a dumb solution by them. So let's go back to nuclear energy, by the way. So if we are producing these, are you pro nuclear energy? You're someone who seems like you weigh the risks and the rewards. And, there's obviously the risk of nuclear waste, but there's the reward of plentiful energy. Is that a risk you're willing to take?
Yeah. Any day of the week. What is the risk of nuclear waste?
I don't know. Tell me there is. The crazies tell me there is.
There's not even that much of it. There's not that much of it. It's not that bad. How many people do you think died in the Fukushima meltdown?
I'm going to say 3 rescuers.
Yeah, it was 1 person.
I would, just because of the way you answered that. But if you had asked me that prior to this conversation, I'd say 500.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
exactly.
It was one. And that is, it's like, I started looking into how many deaths. I had already known, because the sort of pro-nuclear people, if you're around enough of them, you hear stats about how many people die from mining coal and in coal fire plants and oil fire plants. And the numbers are, an insane number higher than anything that nuclear could touch per capita, like far, far, far and away more. One they never talk about for some reason, one no one ever talks about, and I don't know why, is hydro dams. There are dam bursts that have killed like over 100,000 people. Like that. That's crazy. Why does no one talk about that? It's the power of water. It's because of this Fern Gully shit. Again, it's like the idea that nature is pure and good. It's like there's something just less scary to these people about the power of water than nuclear. And it's like, yeah, I'm not worried about nuclear waste. I'm really not. One, I think There's just so little is produced that it's not that big of a deal, and storing it has never been that big of a problem. I mean, it's a problem, but it's a problem that we've been managing fine, and we don't even like. There's once you have like resources behind it and you're expanding and stuff, like we're gonna have a way to take care of just store nuclear waste. But two, what you're not accounting for is technological innovation. You're not accounting for new breakthroughs. There are ways, these are all theoretical, but there are potentially ways to draw energy out of the nuclear waste and sort of so you reduce your amount even further. And now you're powering things with waste and you still have some left over at the end of that process, but it's way less. And this is all based on just theory that we know today. And it's all sort of assuming that not much is developed technologically in the years to come. I think that's a bad bet. I think it's better to bet on the progress.
Why are they opposed to nuclear? Is it something, are they just, the government slash, the left part of the government, the climate extremists seem to create this wall in opposition to it. And sometimes I wonder.
On the environmentalists, you get a mix. I think that there are many people who are, as I was mentioning before, they don't like, it's just the way it seems. It doesn't seem natural. It's glowing green, like Mr. Burns from Simpsons aesthetic. And it's just like the vibes are way off for what they want the power of the sun on their roof, fueling everything. They want the power of water and wind. It's like Captain Planet is what is shaping their entire worldview. That's part of it for them. I think that among the hardcore environmentalists, I think there's an understanding that nuclear solves a lot of our problems and allows us to produce more, not less. We're going to be growing the human population at that point. It's going to be cheaper to do so. And that is the highest level threat they see people as a disease on this planet. They see nuclear they see it maybe in the same way that I do, which is a solution to a problem. We need energy, but they don't want the problem solved is the difference.
Let me ask you sort of on that subject, but not really. I don't know. Did you see the story today about Ford getting a huge government loan to build the 3 EV factories here in the U.S.?
I didn't see that.
The basic headline is Ford's getting, I think it was 9.8.
9.4, whatever. Yeah, billion.
Over $9 billion loan from the government to build EV factories. And while I'm for public-private partnerships, sort of more generally, I'm not sure how I'm for them. Do they ever bother you? Do these kind of things feel like a government overreach? Let's forget the specific story, but this famously the right went really hard at Obama for the solar powered company. Solyndra, that's it. That got all these government loans.
Solyndra was one. It was a part of an entire. Yeah, Solyndra was part of a whole entire movement of just government funded losers in the environmental sort of green space. I'm not really a libertarian anymore on any of this stuff. I think that it's like there's a helplessness about libertarianism where there's a real belief that nothing can be done. It's dangerous. The idea when you say like, oh, the government can't do anything, that's true. It's like they really suck. They keep messing things up, but also they have done all of these things. I mean, they did the Manhattan Project and they did Apollo and they built the interstate highway system. Like there are all these great things. They've won the most important war in the history of the world. And then they kept the planet more or less free from global war for the next, 7 decades or whatever. Like our government has done a lot of good. So it is possible to do good. And the market, I don't believe, does account for everything. The market incentive was to outsource labor to China. And now a libertarian would say like, well, that's only because we had these really high like minimum wages and things like that. And so they were just responding to the incentives that we produced with the government and blah, blah, blah. And my enduring frustration with libertarians is you could see in this conversation, which would be like, that is true, but what is the plan moving forward? And their plan is just, outsource the labor because they're not going to change the labor laws. And no one is. I mean, those are locked in. Like you could fight that fight, but the question is not like what would work in an ideal, what would be best for us in an ideal society? That might be something like the sort of libertarian fantasy. The question is like, what would be best right now? Us funding these plants or building them in China? Those are our options. And so if those are our options, then I'm siding with America funding the plants all day long. That's the thing that we need to do. And so, yeah, I'm pro all this shit. I have written a little bit about like, am I a mercantilist a little bit? Maybe now. Like I want the government. I want the government protecting our shit. I want trade repercussions. When Europe throws down, when the EU throws down some crazy regulation that's going to like, ban AI or whatever other bullshit. Okay, cool. Let's throw down a bunch of trade embargoes of our own. You can do that and you can block the technology. You can try and do some dumb thing online where we all have to click boxes that allow cookies for the rest of our lives. And now we're going to tax, whatever imports you're trying to give of some annoyingly critical product of yours. We're going to tax it like 300%. And that's what I want to see. I want to see our government actually really working with, I want to see more government and industry sort of collaboration, collusion, if you want to call it the more insidious version. I would love some government capitalism or government industry collusion. Would love it. Want to see it. They're both American. It's the American government, American industry. That it's American is what I see, and I want us to be thriving.
Okay, and by the way, I love this conversation. I'm going to push back in 2 points, and I want you to tell me where I'm crazy and where I'm wrong. When I looked at the Ford thing immediately, it is no question to me that since Elon Musk had purchased Twitter, he's fallen out of some favor with the government. He was taken off some ESG lists, and some people pointed out to me, well, ESG is BlackRock and Vanguard. Now, unless BlackRock and Vanguard have sold the government back out, that's still the government to me. But anyway, so to me, it seemed like Elon Musk, yeah, you make the best EVs, but it's misallocated even within the space. But then two, I would say to you, if the government is pouring all this into this technology, which is it seems good, although there's some suspect nature to the EVs and the recycling of the batteries and how much really it is better for us. Which one of those points am I totally wrong on?
Well, I don't know if you're making, so on the Elon thing, you're saying it's wrong that he's being punished or whatever it is.
Yeah, misallocation within the space. You know what I mean? Like, why Ford? Because Ford is that's somebody's brother-in-law. I'm always suspect to this shit.
I think it's right. I think that it's a good point, and you should be suspicious, and there should be a lot of conversation about that. And my problem, and if there should be some, forced fair way, like if every American company can petition for the same treatment or whatever, like I'm happy with any kind of conversation you want to have there. I just don't think that's a reason to shut off the conversation that's the more sort of this conversation in the international context, which is like the question of whether or not we should be benefiting our own companies at the expense of our foreign competitors. Because the answer to that question is like, yes, we should be doing that. We should absolutely, they're doing that. And that's why we're in the fucking mess that we're in now with all the manufacturing abroad, because their governments are assisting them every step of the way, because they understand that having industry at home, manufacturing at home, is a huge critical national security asset. And we're at a disadvantage right now. And we're sort of, I would say, vulnerable. COVID proved that. COVID was what I was like softly into this stuff before that. I was open to it. COVID really radicalized me on this. It's like, you need manufacturing at home. And if you don't, you're really not safe. So that's in the broader international context, it's just not a question for me. And then, as you mentioned, that's a good point. Like, nationally, we need to have a conversation, and we shouldn't have our government choosing winners in those sort of contexts.
2023 JD Power initial quality survey. Tesla's now second from last.
That's a bunch of shit. Somebody paid off those people too, I think.
Yeah, and actually, I saw the tweet was from Gordon Johnson, who's actually been on the show, and he just hates Tesla. I mean, he just hates them.
My buddies who have Teslas love them, though. So I don't know. Yeah. Maybe Oh, and by the way, Mike, I know, like, I love being told that I'm wrong. I think I'm right about everything, and I'm obnoxious about it. But we are trading floor guys. If you want to punch us around at any time, please do. The second part of my question was about investing so much in a particular technology and not even being certain if that's the right technology.
I mean, but that's the history of all investment in technology. You fund things. That's the history. That's what venture capital is, not in less, maybe so. It used to be more of a technological sense. Now it's in a business sense. But I mean, most things don't work, and the things that work really work. And that's the goal. DARPA, the history of DARPA is just government funding random
Hold on,
shit.
what's DARPA again?
It's the defense. I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it's like, it's the government. It's a ton of money the government puts into like technology innovation in the space of defense. It's tech and science innovation. And so most of that stuff is, most of them are not useful or whatever, but you also just need to be putting money into pure research. You need to be having people researching random shit that doesn't pan out, and eventually something will, and some clever technologist will see that thing that works and they'll apply it in a unique way. And then we'll have something important that makes the world better.
DARPA is Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And I did fucking look that up. I don't have
like famously, it's responsible for the internet. DARPANet is where it all began.
So the thing about the $9 billion loan, Bobby, then I'll throw to
Yeah,
you,
go.
is that the program that they set up for that, they've only lent $30 billion. It's been in existence for the last 14 years. So this is essentially increases it, exponentially, and they've increased the amount for loan to 400 billion. So that I just was throwing that out there because it does seem like they're getting a little fast and loose and cavalier with our dollars. But Bobby, I know you had a question.
I did. Mike, are you familiar with Vivek Ramaswamy?
He was the guy that ran.
This is a
He's the guy
biotech
who's running
firm.
for president, right? He's running for
Yeah.
Yeah,
president.
he's
Is that the
running
one
for
you're talking
president.
about?
Actually,
Yeah, I'm familiar with him.
he was kind enough to come on the podcast, and one of the things he pointed out, very along the same lines as you, is basically saying we needed to basically, for lack of a better word, insource our manufacturing, especially of chips and other things that are critical, and that our supply lines can be cut off. And we didn't get into the loans with him, but one of the things he said, and I'm curious on your take on this, was if he wins, which he doesn't seem like he has a shot at this point, he'd have a conversation with the American people saying, look, you have to sacrifice a little bit of quality of life to get where we need to go. Bring manufacturing back home. Some prices may go up. You may have to stick with your iPhone 13 for a few years till we get these things sorted out. Do you think that's a reasonable way to look at it?
I don't like him, but I do think that that's reasonable. I don't know that you need to do it right now. I think that there's a like I don't think you need to, I don't think there needs to be a sacrifice right now. But I think that there is a world where tensions escalate in Asia, and we have to make a decision between like very expensive iPhones and control of like our entire chip supply to China. If overnight we lost our supply of advanced chips, we would have to do a lot of work at home to shore them up ourselves. And that would take a few years, and all the new products would be really expensive. And I think that is okay in the short term. In the long term, I just don't really believe that that's going to be a thing. I think it's like if he's talking about total nationalism or like isolationism, and we're not trading at all with anybody ever again for anything, then I would disagree. And that would require, I mean, you can't have exorbitant labor costs and also everything built in America and not have, everything that we buy costing 10 to 100 times more. It would be insane. Unfortunately, we've built our world on two things that are incompatible, which is like this massive bloated social welfare state and also the idea that there will be limitless cheap products for all time, that you'll be able to buy everything you need on Amazon for, like $10 or something. You can't have both and you especially can't have both. I think it's like probably not sustainable forever to have both. And it's especially not possible to have both in an isolated world. So I don't know what the context he meant in terms of when we're going to have to make that sacrifice. And I would just be curious about that. But I think probably, if that was a question, I would say, yeah, we should, if we had to do it to shore up manufacturing because of some temporary decision or whatever, yeah, it's easily a thing that we should be able to do.
So pivoting a little bit, if somebody said to me, why do you read Pirate Wires? I would send them to Debatable Tactics. That last article you wrote, because I listened to Rogan as well. And I was out of my mind when he put up that Dr. Peter Hotez should debate RFK for $100,000 to charity. It's kind of something I'd like to hear. I don't know that I would learn anything either way. And then I read your article and it made sense to me. So if somebody said to me, why do you read Mike Solana's Pirate Wires? I would send them this article. Can you talk about that a little bit as to why you thought that would be a dumb idea for any scientist to debate on Rogan?
I don't know that it's a dumb idea so much as the things that make you good at a podcast are not the same things that make you good at science. Podcasting, media in general, let's say, is like it's charisma and quickness, and then debating in particular is a whole other can of worms. It's like you are dismantling arguments, you are playing to an audience. So you're not even trying to really persuade the person you're talking to. You're trying to persuade the audience who's watching you. And so you get into the realm of all sorts of weird rhetorical tactics, and it's just science, pure science. What is this sort of ideal of science? What should we be striving towards? What that is an interrogation of reality in as objective a manner as possible. And there are all sorts of disagreements there, but they're not disagreements on what you want to be the case. It's like you're disagreeing on what is in front of you, that you're measuring and what it means. And even that is sort of like the real ideal of a scientist is not even to necessarily hold strongly to an opinion. My piece is sort of like the invitation of this man to debate is kind of cringy as someone who says Joe and his entire team who was like supporting that. They were like, if you care about science, you'll come debate it. It's like, that's not really how science works, and that's not how I want my scientists to act. However, the guy he was talking to is awful. I can't stand him. Hate him way more. Like, I like Joe, and I think Joe stands for way better things. The guy Hotez, the sort of science hobbit type person, he's a total appealing to authority type person. He's like, just today I saw a tweet of his. I mean, he's been incessantly tweeting about this for a week, ever since he was invited to this debate. He's considering it harassment, and it's just like he's a very untethered, attention-seeking person. He's awful. But someone, Jordan Peterson, I think, went after him and said, you're not serious. I don't even know what he said, but Hotez's response was he cited like 10 different, it was like the Washington Post and Vox.com and all of these journals who had defended him, the LA Times. And he's like, well, this is what they said. And that's an appeal to authority. That's not science. So the problem with Hotez is he's not acting like a scientist, and the expectation that we just kiss the ring of these self-appointed experts, or these media appointed experts, is really existentially dangerous. I mean that existentially. We could all die because of it, as we saw during COVID. Like, that's a way bigger problem than Joe inviting this man onto his podcast for a debate. And the truth, the more you think about it, it's like, is Hotez even actually a man of science at this point, based on his behavior and the way that he expects people to sort of just listen to authority and things like this? Those all strike me as not very like scientific type things. They're not in keeping with what a scientist's approach to the world and sort of understanding it should be. So there are two distinct ideas there. And the first is that, I have an ideal in my own mind of an expectation of what a scientist should look like, and how we should treat a scientist, and how we should also learn about the world through the scientific method, all of us. The enduring problem that we have is not that they won't debate us, it's that they don't exist. Like, where are the scientists? Where are the people who live up to that ideal? They're not here. And that is the bigger problem. So it's like, it was cringy. I agree with that. But let's keep our eye on the prize. Like what kind of world do we want to live in? What is the thing that we're striving towards here? And what are we lacking? And what we're lacking are like real, quote, it's not that I don't believe that experts exist. It's like, I would like to see one. I know that they can exist.
Yeah. And that's kind of, Jimmy, if you'll allow me, I just want to read this last paragraph, because this is exactly why I read this fucking Substack, is because the last paragraph of that piece I'm mentioning is, debates are stupid and no scientist should be expected to defend himself on Rogan, but the canonization of our experts is existentially dangerous. Assuming public health is earnestly our priority, it's worth noting humility is the only thing capable of easing back the public's rage. My suggestions for experts as they attempt it, which is not a moral expectation, but a piece of good tactical advice. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
And my question actually goes right on top of that, because I love that. So now let's flip it over. And at the beginning of the pandemic, John Ioannidis, Harvey Risch, Robert Malone, Peter McCullough, as soon as scientists all lined up and started saying anything bad, I mean, everything you read about them was discredited doctor, crackpot scientist, despite the fact that they had good careers prior to
horrific.
That was a bunch of horseshit, yes?
The political mediation of truth. That's because we live in a one-party state. It's controlled by the left, and they control every single lever of power. I'm not saying that the right controlled everything. I don't think it would be any better, but it would be worse and better in different ways. It would be a different sort of light dystopia, which is what I think we're living through right now. It's like the slow collapse of a once great nation. Hopefully we can turn it around, but they certainly control everything. They control Hollywood, you control banking, now they control all the ounce of actual political power, obviously control tech. Like, there's really nothing there that's not controlled by the left. And when you have that kind of power, as we saw sort of really at the height of COVID, censorship just de facto happens. It's like,
such bullshit.
Yeah, there was one, it wasn't a scientific, I mean, the beliefs, the thing about belief science, what made it shameful was not even just necessarily that that's not how science works. Science is not to be believed, it's to be tested, and it's a way of learning about the world. It's not like a set of rules about how things work. It's a method, to getting to the truth. Scientists were chosen based on what they already believed, and we watched the science change constantly throughout. So no, like they don't believe in the science. But the important thing to keep in mind is that, like, just because they say they believe in the science and they don't, doesn't mean like science doesn't exist and isn't important. It does exist, and it's very important. And there are certain, ideals that we should be striving towards in this space.
So then RFK, then we talked about him. I don't know if he's a crackpot or not, but what I do know, and again, I'm not lining up to vote for him. The one thing I love about him, you said who they control. He has what seems like crackpot notions about vaccines in general, but he seems to be a champion of choice. And one of the things you mentioned before was about when they started forcing people to get vaccines. And I think that's one of the reasons I got the vaccine. My family was pressuring me, and I wanted to have some moral ground to start pointing fingers and going, if you start to force people and round them up, I will be fighting for them. So is RFK a good candidate just based on the fact that he's not an authoritarian?
No. And I think our
I agree, by the way.
Our expectations are so low. Like, this is, I see
and they're
friends
still
of mine
disappointed, by the way. Our expectations are so low, and they come under.
I see friends of mine talking about RFK. They're like, sure, he thinks HIV is a hoax and Wi-Fi gives you cancer, and every other crackpot theory you can think. Xanax is the reason that all the school shootings exist, and like endless. Which, listen, I'm not saying no to all of these things. I'm saying I've looked at it and it seems unlikely to me. But then they'll be like, sure, but like he also is against war. And it's like, okay, well, there are a lot of people who are against war, that doesn't mean that every other crazy thing you believe is good. And there are a lot of people who are nice people who have, perfectly reasonable opinions on everything and thoughtful, and we probably disagree on stuff, but they're not bad. They're still not fit for to be president. That's not what there are other things that we're caring about here. It's not just like this guy said this one thing that I agree with, and he gets the choice thing right, and so that matters. What I will say is the choice thing, the COVID thing in general, is why he's so popular, because he's the only candidate who really is running on, I'm not going to gaslight you. I saw what happened under COVID, and it was fucked up. The coercion was fucked up. The vaccine thing was fucked up. The lockdowns were fucked up. What happened to the schools were fucked up. All of that was fucked. The fact that it came from a lab and we couldn't talk about it and nothing happened to anybody who was responsible for that, that's fucked up. And when you're lied to for so long, and someone just says the truth, it's really, really intoxicating. And so that's why he's popular. I don't think he'd be a good president. I'm glad I'm glad he's talking about COVID stuff. I think it's important. I think that there does need to be an accounting of everything that happened under COVID. I don't think there's going to be, but yeah, I will say that I will not say that I think he'd be a good president, but I understand his popularity, and I don't begrudge people who find themselves endeared to him because of that stuff. I think it's important what he's saying about that.
I hate to do it, but I don't want you to say no to us next time, so I'm going to kick you out at your hard stop. I wish we had time to go through the Trump indictment, but it's in Pirate Wires. Tell everyone how they can find you, and that podcast is great, by the way.
For sure. Thank you very much. Just go to Pirate Wires, piratewires.com, and subscribe with your email address. We got a 3 times a week newsletter. Plus I'll write an essay. I got one coming out tomorrow. I wrote one on Monday. Usually it's once every other week, but I got inspired this week. And in our newsletters, we link to our podcast and everything else.
Nice to meet you, Mike.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for having me.
Pleasure, man.